Good morning, everybody. Uneducated economist here. So I thought I'd carry on from yesterday's video. We were talking about the Federal Reserve knowing that inflation was going to be a problem, but it wasn't that the rising of inflation was going to be the problem for the Fed. It was deflation that was the problem, or the lack of inflation, or too low of expectations, inflation expectations. I've been referring back to this Federal Reserve speech given by John Williams titled Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. This was given November 30th, 2018. So you got to think it was just a little over a year before the pandemic really kicked in. Because you think it was just after 2020, what was it, March of 2020 or so, that the pandemic was really starting to kick in. And this speech was given in November 30th of 2018. So it was just a little over a year before all that stuff kicked in, and started happening. But this is what they had to say, and let me read you this part again. I don't know if you guys remember this from the last video, but this is kind of an important part right here. It says, this downward shift in inflation expectation, because you got to remember this is 2018. Remember Donald Trump was even screaming at the time, "There's no inflation." You remember he was like, it was all over the news. You can go find it. Like look at all the news clips of it. This downward shift in inflation expectation has a second round effect on real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. Hear that? They say two different things: inflation expectation, real interest rates, the economy, and inflation. This inflation expectations that they're talking about. All right, anyway, when policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. Even in times when policy is not constrained, the expectation of below target inflation in the future affects current decisions, putting additional downward pressure on inflation. In other words, monetary policy is always swimming upstream, fighting a current of too low inflation expectation that interferes with achieving the target inflation rate. You guys get that? So up until November of 2018, at least when this speech was given, it wasn't inflation that they were even remotely concerned about. It was deflation. It was the fact that they did not have the inflation at the target rate that they were hoping for, not since all the quantitative easings that had taken place. So, and if you listen to that part there where it says this, when policy is constrained by the effective lower bound, the downward shift in inflation expectation raises the real interest rates, further diminishing the degree of monetary stimulus, making the downturn worse and reducing inflation even more. So this is something that, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around of what he is trying to say. When you have, like, say an investor, this is the way I best describe it. Say an investor is anticipating getting a 2% return, and inflation is 1%. The real interest rate that the investor get is 1%. If you can lower the inflation expectation, you can raise the real interest rates, what the investor is really going to get. Does that kind of make sense? So if you can lower the inflation expectation, you can raise the real interest rates. Well, think about it the other way around. If you can raise the inflation expectations, right, you can lower the real interest rates. Buying a house at 3% guarantees your purchasing power at 3%, at a 3% loss, right? Because you're going to end up paying a 3% interest rate on all these payments for your house. But it's better than holding on to your money and losing it to an 8% loss of purchasing power going into the future. So you can guarantee your loss of purchasing power at 3%, but it's better to go ahead and lose 3% now guaranteed than to lose 8% going into the future. You see? If you can raise the inflation expectation, you can lower the real interest rates. Anyhow, try and wrap your head around that one. Okay, so as far as trying to deal with the too low of inflation, is that there's a number of alternative monetary policy frameworks. This is where he goes into talking about what could possibly be done. A number of alternative monetary policy frameworks have been proposed that aim to tackle the problems associated with the lower bound on interest rates. Although they differ in many ways, it is useful to divide these proposals into three broad categories. The first option is to maintain the basic framework of inflation targeting and to rely on a combination of aggressive conventional and unconventional policy actions when facing economic downturns to limit the deleterious effects of the lower bound. This carries with it the risk that inflation expectations become anchored at too low a level. So basically, he's saying that we just go ahead and just kind of maintain this idea that we're going to go for a 2% target, even though it hasn't worked, use the aggressive conventional and unconventional policies, and try to, when facing the next downturn. He says that this is limited and carries the risk that inflation expectations becomes anchored too low. Like it doesn't work, is what they're trying to say. The second option, here we go, now listen up. The second option is average inflation targeting, whereby the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation rate in what they quote good times when the lower bound is not a constraint. Properly designed and implemented, such an overshoot can offset the inflation undershoot during bad times, so that the longer run average inflation and inflation expectations are in line with the target. So does that not sound exactly like what the Federal Reserve is talking about doing? I mean, just remember a few months ago they were talking about letting inflation run extra hot for a while. Just like what they're saying here, they're going for the average inflation rate. And so if we remember from the previous video where he was talking about if inflation is running at 80% of the time and it hits the target 80% of the time and is running under the target 20% of the time, instead of having a 2% average, you end up with a 1.8% average because you can't hit this target consistently. So instead, they're going for this average inflation where at times you're going to be running way over the 2% target in order to achieve that average inflation over time. Anyway, knowing that part of things, that they were going for this average inflation. Oh, let me read you the third part too. The third option is price level targeting, including its various offshoots such as nominal GDP targeting and temporary price level targeting. In such a regime, the central bank commits to keeping the price level near and steady growing target path, like average inflation targeting. This strategy promises to overshoot the target inflation rate in good times to make up for inflation undershoot when the policy is not constrained. Now, I think that a lot of that is probably talking about like yield curve control kind of stuff, which didn't exactly happen. It was more of just the quantitative easings inside of the purchases of treasuries. They did talk a lot about yield curve control, but they didn't quite do that. Not in the sense, not like a lot of people accused them of it, but anyway, they didn't come right out and say this is what we're doing. Anyway, it goes in theory, both average inflation and price target inflation can solve the problem of anchoring inflation expectations at the rate while maintaining a low inflation target rate amid low neutral rates. Although the price level targeting is a bigger leap from inflation targeting than average inflation targeting, each can be implemented in ways that are very similar to standard inflation targeting, either in terms of forecasting targeting or policy rule. So forecasting targeting, this is where like they are jawboning the forward guidance, credible threats. This is exactly what they're saying. And right now they are using that for pretty much all their monetary policy. Like if they want to do something as far as a monetary policy change or something that they want to implement into this economy, such as like the quantitative easings or something like that, they are giving people a lot of notice. They are telling them way ahead of time, hey, this is what we're doing. We are about ready to do this. In fact, we are going to do it probably on this date going forward. And what they are trying to do is get the markets to like front run them, to go out there and behave as if they have already done it, so that there is no shock to the system when they come out and just all of a sudden just do something. Because like when they just come out and all of a sudden say, hey, we're going to implement a 5% change or a half a point rate hike, all of a sudden the markets are now trying to react to that news. But if they give them like plenty of forward guidance, they're like, hey, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do, then the markets can go out there and do all that work ahead of time to make sure that there is no shocking the system once they get in. This is part of like the whole game, is this credible threats that they're going to do. And so when they do this, they can really get the markets to react and behave in the ways that they are really wanting them to. But when it comes time to actually implementing some of these things that they say that they're going to do, they may not do it. They may not even have to. And we found out a lot about that during the whole pandemic when they set up those special purpose vehicles, especially when it came to the corporate debt lending facility. So we'll talk a little bit more about that probably in another video, but I really wanted to share this one with you. I really wanted to share the idea that the average inflation rate was set up long before the whole pandemic and everything started kicking in. So it's not like it was a brand new idea that all of a sudden they had to come up with because there was this major problem taking place. This was something that they had thought about way ahead of time, and they knew that they were going to do this. Now, here's something you got to think about. I should go into work, but I just can't get this out of my head. When the pandemic started to kick in, this is just something to think about, right? When the pandemic started to kick in and everything started to go into a downturn, right? Housing was going down, people were losing their jobs, everything was going down. This was the recession kicking in. Remember, it hadn't been 12 years since we had our last recession, and so we were due. This pressure relief that was almost forced into the system, you think about it, we severed the supply chain. We told everybody you could not go to work. You can't go do the things that you would normally do and behave like. They shut it down. They shut the whole thing down. When that happened, it was like not only were we headed into a recession, it like boom, dove us into recession. Typically, during this time, during these recessions, the Federal Reserve, in conjunction with the United States, would start bailing out corporations. This is the way that you save jobs. But they didn't do it quite like that because everybody was at home. They told them to stay home. But how do you still bail out the corporations? You can't really bail out the corporations if you don't use the excuse you're trying to save jobs, because that's the only thing that gives it like some sort of like acceptable for the people to accept it, is to think that, okay, well, they're trying to save jobs by bailing out these corporations. But if you have everybody sitting at home and not going to work, then you're not trying to save their jobs. How do you bail out the corporations? How do you get them their funding? Well, you have an unusual and exigent circumstance of the pandemic. An unusual and exigent circumstance that was able to create a special purpose vehicle, which is an entity separated from the Federal Reserve. The Fed and the Treasury together funded this special purpose vehicle with hundreds of billions of dollars, and then put out a crap load of media saying that there is going to be corporate debt purchases by the Fed. They are going to be picking the winners and losers, and they are going to save the fallen angels, and there was all kinds of talk about it. The Fed purchased a little bit of corporate debt. They did. They bought some. The markets went out there and bought tons of corporate debt, way ahead of the Federal Reserve, in anticipation that the Fed was going to be jumping into corporate debt, buying it up, and that they would be able to basically sell it to the Fed. They were going to front run them. Fed sat back and said, good job, boys. We really didn't have to do anything. The markets did all the work for us. All we had to do was just put out the special purpose vehicle and the credible threat, and they took care of business for us. Think about that, and think about that on a grand scale. They're doing this all over the place. This is the whole point of forward guidance. This is the front loading, whatever it is that they want to call it. It's credible threats. I'll leave a link down in the description, both for the speech and to an article talking about the corporate debts. Okay, I got to go to work. Uneducated economist, you guys let me know.